Hey guys, welcome back to this channel, The Voice of the Past. In this video, we will unfold the untold story of the Calloway family's radio signal, a message from the past. Before continuing, if you are new into this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel. Let's start. The small town of Willow Creek had always been the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Nestled between dense forests and winding rivers, it was home to little more than a handful of families who had lived there for generations. Life was quiet, uneventful, until the night Ethan Grayson stumbled upon the Calloway family's radio signal. Ethan was an amateur radio enthusiast, a hobby he had picked up from his late grandfather. His attic was cluttered with old transceivers, dials, and an assortment of tangled wires. Every night, after finishing his shift at the local diner, he would sit in front of his radio and scan the frequencies, hoping to pick up signals from faraway places. Most nights he heard nothing but static or the occasional distant broadcast from a trucker's CB radio. But on one fateful evening, something unusual happened. A faint crackling sound emerged through his speakers. At first, it was nothing but static, until a voice cut through. "This is Jonathan Calloway. If anyone is out there, please respond." Ethan's heart pounded. The Calloway family had vanished without a trace 50 years ago. His fingers hesitated over the dials. The Calloways had been one of Willow Creek's oldest families, their disappearance in 1974 still an unsolved mystery. No bodies had been found, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished from their farmhouse overnight. And yet, here was Jonathan Calloway's voice. Frantic, pleading, trapped in time. "The storm, it's coming. We don't have much time. If anyone hears this..." The voice cut out, replaced by static. Ethan swallowed hard, adjusting the frequency. A cold chill crawled down his spine as he grabbed the microphone. "This is Ethan Grayson. I hear you. How are you broadcasting?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, the voice returned. "Help us." The signal abruptly cut off. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the radio. His mind raced through every possibility. Could this be some kind of hoax? A long-lost transmission bouncing off the atmosphere? Or was it something far more unexplainable? He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His grandfather had often told him stories about the Calloways, how Jonathan Calloway, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 children had simply disappeared one stormy night in 1974. Their house had been left untouched, dinner plates still on the table, the front door left ajar, the family dog barking at nothing. Some believed they had been murdered. Others whispered rumors of something more supernatural, of an unseen force that had taken them, swallowed them whole. But the most chilling theory? Some claimed that, on stormy nights, the Calloway radio signal still played. Ethan had always dismissed it as folklore, until now. Shoving his chair back, he stood and grabbed his flashlight. If this was real, if Jonathan Calloway was somehow reaching out after all these years, he needed to find out why. And he knew exactly where to start. The abandoned Calloway farmhouse. The Calloway farmhouse. 11:48 p.m. The night air was thick with mist as Ethan pulled up to the crumbling remains of the Calloway property. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of a vast field, surrounded by gnarled oak trees that had long since swallowed the dirt road leading to it. No one came here anymore. The town considered it cursed. His headlights flickered as he killed the engine. Stepping out of his car, he felt an eerie stillness settle over the place. The house, once a proud estate, was now little more than a skeleton of its former self, its wooden walls weathered and warped, its windows hollow and dark. A rusted windmill creaked in the distance, its slow, rhythmic groans the only sound breaking the silence. Ethan swallowed hard. He had never believed in ghosts. But standing here, in the shadows of a house that had swallowed an entire family whole, he wasn't so sure. As he stepped onto the porch, the old wooden planks creaked beneath his feet. He reached for the doorknob, hesitating. Then he heard it. A whisper. A voice, faint, distant, coming from inside the house. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to turn and leave, to pretend he had never come. But something inside him wouldn't let him run. The radio signal, the voice, the plea for help. He had to know. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Ethan stepped inside the Calloway farmhouse, his flashlight casting long, trembling beams across the dust-covered floor. The air was thick with the scent of decay, wood rot, and something else. Something metallic, almost like rusted iron. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. He moved cautiously, stepping over broken floorboards and shattered glass, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. The living room looked like something out of a time capsule. The furniture was still in place, covered in dust, as though the family had left in the middle of their evening routine. A ceramic plate lay shattered near the fireplace, the remains of a long-rotted meal smeared across the floor. A rocking chair sat frozen in mid-motion, as if someone had been sitting in it only moments ago. His flashlight caught a glint of something on the wall. Old family portraits, their faces frozen in time, eyes staring out in eerie silence. Ethan moved deeper into the house, his footsteps muffled by thick layers of dust. He knew he should feel foolish, but something about this place, about what he had heard on the radio, kept his nerves on edge. He could still hear the voice in his head, the desperate plea for help. He stepped into the kitchen, and his stomach twisted at the sight. The table was still set, plates and silverware laid out as if the family had intended to return at any moment. A clock on the wall had stopped at exactly 9:13 p.m. Ethan frowned. He had read about this in old newspaper articles, how everything had been left undisturbed the night the Calloways vanished. It was as if time itself had frozen in this house. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small radio receiver he had brought with him. If the signal had come from here, maybe he could pick up something, anything, that would explain how a man who had disappeared 50 years ago had spoken to him just an hour earlier. He turned the dial, adjusting the frequency, listening as static crackled through the speaker. At first, there was nothing, just empty white noise. Then, the signal came back. A deep, rattling breath, then a whisper. Who's there? Ethan's pulse quickened. He swallowed hard, gripping the radio tighter. "My name is Ethan. I heard your broadcast." Silence. Then, Jonathan Calloway's voice, distant and trembling. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan felt a cold sweat forming at the base of his neck. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A long, static-filled pause. Then, the voice returned. "They won't let us leave." The hairs on Ethan's arms stood on end. His eyes darted around the room. "Who won't let you leave?" Before he could get an answer, the entire house groaned, as if something enormous was shifting within the walls. A sudden gust of wind slammed through the hallway, knocking over a chair and sending dust spiraling into the air. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement at the far end of the hallway, a shadow standing perfectly still. The radio let out a sharp burst of static, and Jonathan's voice returned, urgent and terrified. "Get out, now!" Ethan's breath hitched. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to turn around and leave, but something held him in place. He needed to know. He needed answers. He forced himself to take a step forward, toward the hallway where the shadow had been. Then, the static from the radio shifted. It wasn't just white noise anymore. It was something else. Whispers. Not just one voice, many. They overlapped, layered on top of one another, an unintelligible chorus of murmurs that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The whispers grew louder, filling the space around him, until one voice rose above the rest. "Turn around." Ethan spun, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Nothing. Just the empty, dust-covered room. But then, something changed. The air itself felt heavier, thick with something unseen. He took a step backward, and that was when he noticed it. The family portrait on the wall had changed. The faces of the Calloways, once smiling and frozen in time, were now distorted, their eyes hollow and dark, their mouths twisted into expressions of horror. Eleanor Calloway, the mother, had her hands raised, as if clawing at something unseen. The youngest child, Anna, had her mouth open in a silent scream. Ethan felt his stomach drop. This wasn't possible. The whispers from the radio turned into a single word, repeated over and over. "Run." Something moved behind him. He didn't wait. Ethan turned and bolted for the front door, his heart hammering in his chest. He barely noticed the way the house seemed to shift around him, the hallway stretching longer than it had been before. He sprinted forward, ignoring the sensation that something was just behind him, reaching for him. His hand slammed against the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. Footsteps. A breath against the back of his neck. He twisted the knob again, this time with all his strength. The door flew open. Ethan stumbled out onto the porch, hitting the ground hard. The night air was cold, biting against his skin. He scrambled to his feet and turned back toward the house. The front door was closed. The house was still. Silent. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan stood there, gasping for breath, his mind reeling. Had he imagined all of it? The voices, the shifting walls, the thing that had been behind him? Then he looked down. The small radio receiver in his hand was still on, still tuned to the same frequency. And through the static, Jonathan Calloway's voice came one last time. "They know you're here now." Then, silence. Ethan took a step back, his grip tightening around the radio. He didn't know what he had stumbled into, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. He had to find out the truth before it was too late. Ethan sat in his car outside the Calloway farmhouse, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in short gasps, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. He had seen the portrait change, heard the voices whispering, felt something, someone, standing right behind him. And then there was the radio. Jonathan Calloway's last words echoed in his mind. "They know you're here now." Who were they? And why had the house reacted to his presence? His gut told him this wasn't just an old mystery. There was something alive in that house. Something watching. He turned the radio receiver over in his hands, his fingers brushing against the dials. The frequency was still locked in, but now there was nothing but dead air. He wanted to believe that what he had experienced was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had made contact with something real. A sudden rustling outside the car made him jolt upright. His flashlight lay on the passenger seat, and he grabbed it, shining it through the windshield. The darkness beyond the trees seemed to press inward, swallowing everything beyond the narrow beams of light. The windmill groaned again, its rusted blades shifting ever so slightly. But there was something else. Movement. A shadow, just beyond the tree line. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he squinted into the darkness. It was faint, barely distinguishable from the trees, but it was there. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching him. He didn't wait to see what it was. He threw the car into gear and hit the gas, his tires kicking up dirt as he sped away from the farmhouse, away from whatever had been lurking in the trees. He didn't slow down until he reached the main road, the streetlights of Willow Creek finally cutting through the suffocating blackness. His first instinct was to go home, lock his doors, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But he knew he couldn't, not after what he had heard. The Calloway family's story had always been shrouded in mystery, but now, for the first time in 50 years, there was proof that something had happened to them. And Jonathan's message had been clear. He needed help. Ethan pulled into his driveway, shutting off the engine and sitting in silence for a long moment. His house felt safer, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. He needed answers. There was only one person who might have them: Old Man Harris. Harris had been the town's radio operator for as long as anyone could remember. If anyone knew about strange signals, it would be him. Ethan didn't waste any time. He grabbed the radio receiver and drove straight to the other side of town, to the old repair shop where Harris spent most of his days tinkering with radios and talking about the good old days of shortwave communication. The shop was dimly lit, cluttered with wires, radio parts, and stacks of old equipment. The bell above the door jingled as Ethan stepped inside, and a gruff voice called out from the back. "If you're looking for parts, come back tomorrow." Ethan pushed forward, weaving between dusty shelves. "Mr. Harris, it's Ethan Grayson. I need your help." There was a long pause before a figure emerged from behind a workbench. Harris was in his 70s, with a face like worn leather and eyes that had seen too much. He squinted at Ethan, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. "What kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into, boy?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before setting the radio receiver down on the workbench. "I picked up a signal tonight. A voice. Jonathan Calloway." Harris's expression darkened instantly. He slowly set the rag down, his eyes flickering to the radio. "You're playing a dangerous game, son." Ethan leaned forward. "You know something, don't you? About the Calloways. About what happened to them." Harris sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "I heard that signal once. A long time ago." Ethan's breath caught. "When?" 1974, the night they disappeared." The room felt colder. Ethan glanced at the radio, his heartbeat quickening. "You're telling me this signal has been playing for 50 years? "Not always. It comes and goes, and only when a storm's coming." Harris's gaze locked onto Ethan's. "That's how you know it's starting again." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. Jonathan had mentioned a storm, and outside, even now, the air smelled of rain. "What happened to them?" Ethan pressed. "The truth." Harris exhaled slowly. "Nobody knows for sure, but I'll tell you what I saw that night. I was working the late shift at the old radio station when the signal came through. Static at first. Then Jonathan's voice. He kept saying the same thing, over and over. "They're coming. We can't stop them." Harris's jaw tightened. Then the signal cut out, and the next morning, the Calloways were gone. Ethan swallowed hard. "You think something took them?" Harris was silent for a long moment before finally answering. "I think whatever happened to them, it ain't finished." A low rumble of thunder shook the shop, making both men turn toward the window. The sky had darkened, thick clouds rolling in over Willow Creek. Ethan felt the weight of Harris's words settle over him like a heavy blanket. If the signal was back, if the storm was coming, then that meant it was happening again. Before he could say another word, the radio on Harris's desk crackled to life. A burst of static. Then Jonathan's voice. "Ethan, you have to listen to me." The old man stiffened. Ethan's breath caught. Jonathan's voice was louder now, more urgent. "They're coming." The radio let out a sharp screech, and then a new voice, one that didn't belong to Jonathan. It was low, guttural, barely human. Too late. The shop lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Ethan barely had time to react before the radio let out one final deafening burst of static. Then, silence. And from somewhere outside, beyond the shop's fogged-up windows, something moved. Ethan and Harris stood frozen in the darkness of the repair shop, the only sound between them the faint crackle of the now silent radio. Outside, the storm rumbled closer, casting eerie flashes of light through the window. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Harris didn't answer immediately. His hands, steady even in his old age, tightened around the edge of the workbench. "It's them," he finally said. "The ones Jonathan warned us about." Ethan turned toward the window. Shadows stretched across the pavement outside, distorted by the dim streetlights. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting just beyond the glass. A sharp knock at the door made him flinch. Harris grabbed his old shotgun from behind the counter and cocked it. Ethan swallowed hard, stepping toward the door, peering through the blinds. Nothing. No one was there. The street was empty, but that only made it worse. He turned back to Harris. "I think we need to get back to the farmhouse." Harris frowned. "You don't know what you're dealing with, boy." "I don't," Ethan admitted, "but Jonathan does. And he reached out to me for a reason." Harris exhaled sharply, then grabbed his coat. "Damn fool idea," he muttered, but he didn't argue. They left the shop together, stepping into the thick night air. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees. The storm was almost here. As Ethan unlocked his car, the radio receiver in his pocket crackled back to life. Jonathan's voice was faint, distant. "Hurry." Then another sound, something growling beneath the static. They didn't wait. Ethan floored the gas pedal and they sped toward the Calloway farmhouse, the storm chasing them the whole way. The road to the Calloway farmhouse felt longer this time, the night pressing in from all sides. The wind had turned violent, shaking the trees as if warning them to turn back. Rain had begun to fall in thick sheets, the storm arriving in full force. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened as lightning illuminated the road ahead. Harris sat beside him, silent but alert, his shotgun resting across his lap. "We're damn fools for coming back," he muttered. Ethan couldn't argue, but he also knew they had no choice. Jonathan had reached out for a reason. As they neared the farmhouse, the static in Ethan's radio receiver grew louder, almost deafening. He turned it down, but the signal remained strong, pulsing with an unnatural hum beneath the storm. Then, just as the house came into view, the radio spoke again. "They're here." The headlights swept across the front of the farmhouse, revealing the porch, the broken windows, and the front door, wide open. Ethan slammed the brakes. The two men exchanged uneasy glances before stepping out into the storm. The wind howled through the trees as they climbed the steps, water dripping from the rotting wood. Ethan hesitated at the threshold. "Jonathan?" he called out. No answer. The house was the same as before, frozen in time. But now, the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. The whispers had returned, faint but growing stronger. Harris gripped his shotgun. "This ain't right." Then, without warning, the front door slammed shut behind them. Ethan spun around, his heart pounding. The storm raged outside, but inside, the house had fallen into a suffocating silence. Then the lights flickered. A shadow moved at the end of the hall. Ethan's breath hitched. Harris raised his shotgun, aiming down the corridor. Then, from the radio receiver in Ethan's hand, Jonathan's voice came through one last time. "It's too late." A low growl rose from the darkness, and then the lights went out. The darkness inside the Calloway farmhouse was absolute. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he gripped the radio receiver tightly. its static humming like an unnatural heartbeat in his hands. Harris stood rigid beside him, his shotgun raised, his eyes darting through the black void ahead. Then, from deep within the house, the growl came again. Low, rumbling, not human. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Something was here with them, something that had been waiting. The air turned icy, thick with an unseen presence. The walls groaned as if the house itself was alive, shifting under the weight of something terrible. A flash of lightning lit up the room for a split second, and in that instant, Ethan saw them. Figures, twisted, gaunt, with hollowed-out faces. A family frozen in the throes of an eternal nightmare. The Calloways. Their forms flickered like a dying signal, mouths opening in silent screams as they reached toward him. Then darkness swallowed them whole. Harris cursed under his breath. "We have to get out of here." But before Ethan could respond, the whispers returned. Hundreds of them, layered over one another, overlapping, suffocating, pulling at the edges of his sanity. They weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were in the walls. The Calloways weren't the only ones trapped here. The air vibrated, the house shaking violently, as if something enormous was stirring beneath it. The radio in Ethan's hand burned cold against his skin as Jonathan's voice returned, barely audible through the storm. "The basement. Hurry." Ethan turned toward the hallway, where a narrow door stood slightly ajar. The basement. The only place in the house he hadn't searched. Harris grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy?" But Ethan wasn't listening. The whispers were growing louder, and the darkness behind them felt like it was closing in. Whatever force was holding this place hostage, the basement was the key. He ran. The moment he reached the door, a force slammed into him, knocking him off balance. A cold grip wrapped around his ankle, a hand, skeletal and impossibly strong. Harris fired the shotgun. The blast illuminated the hallway for half a second, just enough for Ethan to see what had grabbed him. A thing with sunken eyes, its skin stretched thin over its bones, its mouth an empty void. The gunshot forced it back, its shriek piercing through the house like metal scraping against glass. Ethan scrambled to his feet and yanked the basement door open. Harris was right behind him, and together they stumbled down the stairs. The second they reached the bottom, the door slammed shut above them. The basement was different. Unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't frozen in time. The air here felt raw, alive. The walls pulsed like the inside of something breathing. At the center of the room sat an old radio, untouched by time, its dials glowing with an unnatural blue light. Jonathan's voice crackled through. "You have to break it. It's the anchor. It's what keeps them here." Ethan's mind raced. The Calloways had never truly disappeared. They had been trapped inside the signal, caught in an endless loop, unable to escape. And the radio, this radio, was their prison. Harris fired another round into the darkness, his face pale. "Ethan, whatever you're gonna do it fast." The whispers turned into screams. The walls buckled as the house began to collapse around them. Shadows swirled from the corners, merging into a single, towering form, the thing that had taken them. Ethan didn't think. He grabbed a rusted crowbar from the floor and swung it with everything he had. The first hit cracked the radio's casing. The second shattered the dial. The third, a burst of white light erupted from the radio, engulfing the room. The house screamed. Ethan fell back, shielding his eyes as the force surged through the air. The shadows writhed, twisting in agony, the figure at the center dissolving like mist in the wind. The whispers faded. The air shifted, and then silence. Ethan opened his eyes. The basement was still. The air no longer heavy, no longer suffocating. The Calloways were gone. The nightmare was over. Harris groaned, pushing himself off the ground. "Tell me we're still alive." Ethan let out a breathless laugh. I think so. They climbed the stairs, opening the door. This time, it didn't slam shut behind them. The house had returned to its decayed, abandoned state. The storm outside had passed, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. Ethan stepped onto the porch and turned back to the house, half expecting something to lurch from the shadows. But nothing came. The Calloway family was finally free. Harris clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. If you ever go near another damn radio again, I swear to God. Ethan chuckled, exhaustion settling over him. I think I'm retiring from radio for good. But as they turned toward the car, something caught Ethan's eye. A single radio sitting on the porch, untouched by dust or decay. Its dial flickered once. Then, for the last time, Jonathan's voice came through. Thank you. Ethan smiled. Then the radio clicked off, and this time, it stayed silent. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other stories you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.